Firstly, welcome to BGS. This is so exciting. I have known of your work for a few years now, and I know, at the risk of sounding cheesy, I genuinely feel like, as someone who is experiencing, symptoms of just getting older, and I turned 30 recently, and just watching your journey and like the way that you talk about all aspects of life, womanhood, getting older, defying societal stereotypes, what the world tries to tell you about yourself as a woman. I think it's very empowering. I'm sure you hear that a lot, but I think on an individual level, I don't know whether you realize the extent of the impact you have on people. So
that's very kind of you. I mean, that's a lovely, lovely thing to hear, I think.
Would you be able to introduce yourself to those who don't know who you are?
I am Poorna. I'm an author and a journalist. I also like to lift weights competitively as an amateur. I've had a long career in journalism, about just over 20 years. And yeah, I feel very passionately, especially sort of entering my 40s, I'm 43, about just road mapping a different future and a different path that I think that our parents had for themselves, and also what we've been taught to believe, which is, that getting older is this diminishing of the self, because I think it makes us so scared about getting older, and I think that there can be some incredible things that can take place. So that is, in a nutshell, that is who I am. I also, feel very strongly, anyone who's followed my work, I have done a lot around like mental health awareness as well. It's something I feel very passionately about, but also women's equality is a huge one for me. And just, I think generally it's been a constant theme through my work of writing about, talking about, and making space for marginalized communities in particular.
You've recently started writing fiction, and I think what's very interesting about all of these topics that you've touched over the years is that you incorporate them in various elements and shapes and forms and have done in the last couple of books that you've written. I would like to introduce your most recent book because I think it's very appropriate. So This Is Fine. Tell me a little bit more about I guess what the motivation was for writing it, and maybe if you could give us a little bit of an overview of what it's about and why it's such an important story to you.
I'll start with the overview, if that's okay. So the overview is there is a woman in her late 30s. Her name is Padma, and she's in this 10-year relationship that with a guy who, it's fine. They're in their routine. They accommodate each other, but he's fairly dismissive of her. I think that the balance is more about his career, and she's never really quite gotten herself going, in terms of her work. And they reach a crisis point around whether or not to have kids. He really wants kids. She doesn't, for, different reasons. And at the same time, she has a younger sister called Daisy, and Daisy's daughter, Myra, who is Padma's niece, also hits her own crisis point, falls in with a not so great group of people and ends up with alcohol poisoning. And they're sort of thrust together when Daisy asks Padma to take her niece away for the summer because, she can't do it because she's got to work, and so does her husband. And Padma really doesn't want to do it, but she's kind of doesn't really have very many options. And so the book is essentially looking at Padma's choices and how she finds agency within her own life. It's also the dynamic between her and her niece, and that exchange of ideas and growth and evolution, how Myra helps her to look at her own life and vice versa. It also looks at the very long shadow that family history can cast, and when things are not spoken about. So both of them, their mother has passed away in the book. I mean, she's sort of long dead by the time the book begins, but she was an alcoholic and it was never really spoken about between them. And so there's also an unraveling of that. The reason why I wrote this book, I didn't necessarily know all of that. I mean, you're seeing the finished product, right? And there were several drafts to get to that point. But the idea for the book actually began with Padma's voice. So I started to think about this woman, which is actually mirrored in a lot of relationships that I see around me, a lot of people's relationships, even people that I don't know particularly well, but this coming together of really of women, particularly, let's say, heterosexual women, who are in these like long-term relationships, who are kind of continuing in them because that's what they've been told to strive for and that's what they've been told to aim for, without really considering, is the relationship good for them? Does their partner amplify and support them? And finding that their needs are increasingly being shoved to the back. And at the same time, there is this movement of women just saying, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And particularly for women in their 40s and 50s, generally, this is a stereotype, but I think it's true. Generally, women need to feel like there has to be a reason to leave a marriage or a long-term relationship, like a betrayal, like someone cheating on you, that is so definitively wrong, right, in the eyes of society. And that has been the shift, where women are increasingly not having to justify why they are leaving a bad relationship, because they know it's a bad relationship for 1,000 different reasons, but they're choosing themselves within that, and they're choosing to articulate what they want within that. And I really wanted to chart that shift that I see happening in society now.
With the angle of intersectionality, we are both Desi, and we know that in the various communities within the sort of Desi sphere, it is a lot harder to do that, because women also are only just getting into a position of autonomy and power, of being able to step away from relationships that are outwardly bad based on societal levels. So how do women in our communities, take that agency? I think we're a long way away from that. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, for us, for sure. I think that we're always behind the curve, with certain things. Like, even if you, for example, look at like mental health as a conversation that's in the mainstream in our community, we still have like a very long way to go when it comes to understanding it, and for that to then translate into how people behave with you in the conversations that they have. And I think that in this particular scenario, when it comes to, for example, exiting a bad relationship, or a relationship that's just dragging you down, and or where you're basically looking after your partner as if they are an adult child, right? Which, it's sadly such a common scenario, and also how we're brought up in terms of what is a woman's role and what is a man's role. So I would say for people that are hetero, that have been brought up with those ideals, I think that thinking is not going to come from your family. If you're looking for validation from your family to get out of a situation like that, I know that we've been taught to, deify our families, but it's not going to come from them, and they might not be able to understand and support you within that decision. But I think that in everything that I do, in all of my work, it is to try and wake people up from their lives. And it's not to say that your life is bad, or to convince people to live in another type of way or anything like that. It's just to get people curious and ask them questions about the people that they are with and the life that they are living. Because I don't think that someone should have to be on autopilot during their lives and wake up, in their late 50s or 60s or 70s and realize that they have wasted a lot of time on a relationship that they existed in because everyone else thought that they should, when they are the person most impacted by that. So insofar as people in our community, I think that, quite honestly, that thinking is going to come from other places. I think it's really crucial to have friends that can challenge your thinking and crucially support your decisions, right? Even when they are the decisions that are not the status quo, are not supported by mainstream society. And for me, it's always about, can you get your life to the closest approximation where the friends, for example, that you have in your life genuinely want your happiness, And that is how I think that we free ourselves to be able to think about what we want. Otherwise, it's just, everything is just too enmeshed. It's too entrenched. You're stuck in the root system of something. How can you think differently if you're not sort of exposing yourself to other thought? But also, more importantly, it's to say that no one needs to wait for a terrible situation to exit a marriage or to exit a relationship. We talk about like cheating, for example, as like the ultimate betrayals. I have seen relationships in which there are 1,000 betrayals that happen on a daily or weekly basis, whether it's their partner not supporting them, whether it's comments that their partner makes. And these are all as valid a reason to exit something as it is, a big event. So I would ask people to get curious about that.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And how much do you wait until it's too
Yeah.
much?
And also, like, if you're on your own, that's okay. Like, in fact, it's pretty peaceful, it's really peaceful. There is no drama, So I think sometimes, like, we view the alternative as being so scary, and it really isn't, I don't think.
You talk about wanting to wake people up from their own lives. I kind of want to put the lens back on yourself and going back to this whole thing of complexity. How woken up do you feel in your own life?
I feel very awake, at the moment anyway. That being said, I'm sure that in even as little as like 2 to 3 years, I will look back at where I am now and cringe at maybe some of the things that I come out with and, maybe patterns of thought. So I do think it's very important to evolve and change your thinking. And I think that the older I get, the more crucial I think that is as an experience. But at the moment, I feel like there are things that I might not understand, but I would like to think that my thinking is open to understanding them. And if I compare to where I was maybe like 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't at all. I just sort of either accepted my circumstances or I accepted the worldview that was around me. And I don't think I really had, a lot of like my social circle, my friends and so on, were people that I had known for a really, really long time. Whereas now I still obviously have most of those friends. In the past 4 or 5 years, I have proactively sought out new friendships and people who can meet me where I'm at, or people who just lead different lives or are different ages. And I think that definitely helps me be a lot more aware to what's going on. And I think that has a dual purpose of, number one, it makes you more patient of things, because when people are worrying or freaking out about something, things are so cyclical. You know that actually it's not worth worrying about it because it will ease off, or something new will take its place, or it will be fine. But then there is, if you unfortunately go down the path of cynicism, you do think, oh, it's 2024 and women are still struggling to be seen as equal citizens, and that's exhausting. Yeah. So I think it's two sides of the same coin, depending on what kind of mood I'm in. But I definitely feel like a lot more aware of what's going on at the moment. And just, I think, how broad people's lifestyles can be, which I wasn't before.
I sometimes think about this as well, actually, like complacency and generally just following the status quo, because I think in some ways I rebel by, speaking up about things that I necessarily don't agree with, that are the status quo. But I think sometimes in my own actions, or like, in my friendship circles, I do very much see that I'm in an echo chamber. All my friends are very similar in terms of like age, that maybe demographic, maybe things that are going on in our lives, like slightly different because we're in our like early 30s. So we are all going through different things. But I am very conscious of this because I'm like, anyone who knows me knows like most of my friends are Asian, and it happened when I moved to London, and it wasn't a thing when I was younger, but like I sought comfort in that here, and that's really empowered me, because it's also given me I guess the tools to learn more about our experiences and like the nuances. But at the same time, I'm like, I need to break away. I need to have friends who are like very different to me so that I can learn more about the world. Do you think that every one of us has that responsibility? Or do you think we fall into that at certain points in our life when, we hit a certain age and we're like, wait, what am I doing?
I think with friendships, there can be ebbs and flows. And I think that with our relationship with ourselves, so our identities, there are ebbs and flows. So slightly similar to you in that there were moments where I was growing up and there weren't that many Asians around. And then when I went to university, there were. And then there weren't, as I sort of, moved up in the workforce and worked in journalism, which is still, very overwhelmingly white. And now I feel in the last few years, thanks to actually a lot of, I would say Instagram is a big part of this, but there are these little communities of especially creative South Asians where I can see the work that they're doing, and I can also be part of, that as a group in a way that I don't think we would have been able to find each other before. And so that allows me to see how incredible like our output is, you know, as a community. Because sometimes things that like reach the mainstream are just so diluted for me. I could never really connect with them or feel represented by them. I would say that when it comes to friendships, I don't think that we can, you know, actively like a menu, like tick off.
Oh,
okay,
what boxes
so
will I
that
tick?
friend makes me really woke, and that friend, yeah. So I just don't think it works like that, because a friendship is like a romantic relationship. It's an organic thing. You know, there has to be connection. But I think it is being more aware of, you know, so when I say proactive, for example, like you're in your 30s, right? And I remember in my 30s going through two sort of quite painful periods with my friends, in terms of their lives were changing in a way that mine just wasn't. And I just felt like I was just losing them, and that there was nowhere or no way for me to make new friends. And I think that that's a rite of passage. Like, it will happen, you know, in a person's life in their 30s. And when you consider that, you know, being able to make friends is not just something you can do at school, at uni. It's not like a finite, you know, skill. You get to do that over and over again during the course of a lifetime. But I think it's the understanding that these people don't just drop into your lap, that actually you have to be quite intentional and say, hey, do you want to go for coffee? Or I don't know, suggest something that you know that the other person likes doing, and then see whether or not you have a spark or a connection in exactly the same way that you would do if you were asking someone out on a date. But I think it's being open to who you're asking and why you're asking them, and so on. I don't think that you can just ask them because they fit a certain criteria. I just think that it is being aware of what your friendship circle looks like. Like, I find some people who I follow on Instagram hilarious, like when they go away on birthdays and hen dos, and it's very one type of a demographic, right? And I'm like, how diverse is your thought or your friendship circle? Because your friendship circle doesn't look particularly diverse. So I think it's important to mix it up. But I also have a lot of Asian friends, and I don't make any apologies for that, because the world I move in is not like that at all. So I feel sometimes I need that even more so. I don't know how you feel about that.
It's actually very interesting, because when I moved to this country, I think so many factors had changed for me, particularly weather being the biggest one. And I think what it was coming to London, and I saw so many similar people who, like, to me, you know, people that had very similar, like, nuanced experiences growing up, the way their parents were with them, or, you know, like just the way they felt in school, as an example. And I've talked about this at length in previous episodes, but that was so, I think that comfort was so unspoken. It's like there was just an understanding without having to explain. And it went from being like exhausting in my previous environments to suddenly being comforting. And then as I got older, I then realized, okay, this is too comfortable, you know. And now I'm at a stage where I'm like, hold on a minute, like, am I falling too much in one direction? And I am very conscious of that, because I actually have a lot of friends like at work who are outside that demographic. But at the same time, like, do I maintain the friendships outside of work with them? Probably not as much. And that intentionality, I think, is very key that you've mentioned, because we forget, right, as we're getting older, also, like, well, you've said it, you know, friends go through very different things, and friendships evolve and change, and circumstances change. So, like, we have to be intentional about it. But I think it's a very topical thing in my own life, and actually in a lot of my friends' lives, because this is that age we're in our early 30s, where everyone's a bit confused because everyone's really overwhelmed and busy, and we're all like little children but in adult suits, I think. That's how I feel as a millennial. I don't know if you feel that way.
That's a very, very good way of describing it, because you're just like, I'm in my 30s and I think I should be a certain way, but I don't feel like that. It's like kind of three kids under a trench coat. You just don't feel like I am that. You're just like, oh, but I mean, I would say that I don't feel like that anymore, but that's only because I think 40 is it's an incredible decade. It is. Wow. It is such a cool decade, because you get to actually feel what your power is. You're not playing a part, you know, you actually just feel it. It's like in your bones. And so the position that you're operating from Like you find yourselves in you know, certain scenarios, like especially this week, I found myself dealing with people who are like very anxious around me or behaving in a way that really would have wrong-footed me before, you know. I would have sort of taken it upon myself or felt very insecure. And it just doesn't feel like that. Like it's sort of this real surety of, oh no, this is who I am, and it's sort of building on that. And I would just say I know you've just turned 30, but you've got a great decade in the next one for sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. You make it look cool for sure. I'm looking forward to 40. But also, I wanted to go back to your writing because you actually touch on a lot of this in your book and in your previous one, actually. One thing, a theme that really stood out to me when I was reading it was this sort of like, let's say, cross-generational experience of mental health. So it's like Padma is going through her own experience in This Is Fine with her own mental health. And then she's sort of like trying to almost put that aside and then look at her niece's mental health. And I just wanted to understand whether that's a very intentional thing that you introduced in this book based on, I don't know, things you've seen around you or in your own life.
I think it's more based on things that I've seen around me, because, you know, her mother, when she thinks about her mother, and that's sort of like a key part of that as well, in terms of why did her mother become an alcoholic? Was it due to circumstances? Because, you know, her dad like left when a couple of days after Daisy was born and then just never came back. And it's sort of then this I guess like this appraisal of maybe what her mother was going through, and did her mother also have depression, and was that something that she was going through? And it was important to look at that generation, you know, her mother's generation, of how I know people of that age can sometimes deal with things as a coping mechanism to deal with, you know, various traumas that are going on. And then it was important to look at it for Padma's generation and to see how which is very representative of my generation, which is where she'd felt like this, you know, in her early 20s, but didn't really have the language to describe what it was until she was with someone who could actually tell her what this was. And then she could kind of get treatment for it. And then I think looking ahead to Myra and wondering whether or not it's something that she's going through, I think it's that for me was representative of Gen Z, or what's the other one? Is it Gen
Alpha?
Alpha?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, she's either one of the two, but they are so much more switched on to this kind of stuff. And I think in terms of actually also being responsive to things that are going to help, that was representative, I think, of that generation's drive and desire. And also they know this stuff because most of them have now been raised or schooled in it, right? And I think it's an incredible thing to see what can happen to a generation who are actually brought up with an understanding of mental health versus like previous generations who did not know what they were doing really because they just didn't have the language to describe what it was that they were going through, or it was so highly stigmatized against that even if they knew what they were going through, they wouldn't have felt comfortable being able to talk about it or to tell someone that that's what was happening. She goes, because Padma goes to great lengths to keep it from her sister. She her partner is the only one that really knows what's going on, and having to do that, this sort of smoke and mirrors kind of managing what your outward projection is something that I have seen other people do, and I just wanted to also write that in there as well.
To play a little bit devil's advocate on the Myra experience, because I do agree with you in that Gen Z are being schooled in that a lot more, and there's a lot more just normalization around these topics, but there's also a watered down nature of it when you're receiving that education, say in mainstream media or on social media, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether sometimes this generation can actually get, I don't know, like the wrong end of the stick, or like misunderstand what mental health is, or like sensationalize and over trivialize it, because, it's just so widely spoken about. It's almost like a bit trendy. Like, we talk about that quite a bit. And do you think there's a difference between the way mental health is spoken about in that way versus what someone's really going through? Because, Myra does go through those periods of depression and she doesn't really talk about it either when she's going through it.
We're still at a stage where it's okay to talk about mental health. It's not okay to talk about mental illness. If someone is really mentally ill, I don't think that most people know how to deal with it, and most people react very badly to it. And that has always been a really big bugbear of mine. We've just had Mental Health Awareness Week, and it's focused on movement, which, hey, you know what? I'm a massive advocate for movement when it comes to managing the baseline of your mental well-being. But where is mental illness in that conversation? And I think what you're saying is that, for example, I consume a lot of TikTok, and I think that there is a case to be made for like the overuse of certain words, like the kind of armchair psychology from people that are really probably not qualified to be talking about this stuff. And so you hear these phrases like filter into people's conversations in a way that I'm really conflicted, because on the one hand, I'm like, okay, it's good that you're aware of what's happening with you mentally, but I also feel like it gives people a definition around something that may not necessarily apply to them, and a reason to abdicate responsibility around their own actions in some cases. I think that TikTok can be helpful around certain things, but I still think when it comes to things that are like fundamentally wrong, there is still this hesitation around, should I go and get help for this thing? Yeah. And even if you did want to get help in the UK, there's no help to be had, because we live in a system that is so overburdened and so overstretched and so underfunded. So there are a lot of things that are going on. I think that it's very hard to sort of specifically say, oh, well, I think that they're sensationalizing things, because I think that the sort of the flip side to people not talking about this stuff and to just blanket ignoring it perhaps is that other end of the spectrum, which is just to kind of like diagnose and medicalize everything. But I still think that we're in a better position now than we were when we just didn't talk about any of the stuff at all. And I think that it will balance itself out eventually.
Yeah, it's like we're at that stepping stone where it's like, overly spoken about in too generic terms.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is I get this advert on YouTube a lot. You may have received it as well. It's for this like therapy service, and it's just like this young girl, and she's Gen Z, and she's just like, I've just had a therapy session, I feel great, and I'm having a cup of tea. I had a therapy session this week, Poorna, and I opened a can of worms in my own life, and I felt like poo. Like I literally left that session, and this is like massively oversharing on here, but I think it's important to know, like, I genuinely felt like shit the whole week after. And I was just like, this therapy thing is like not that straightforward, because you do think, oh, I'm just gonna like rant everything out and feel great, and like we know that it's not always like that, but there's some times where it actually makes you feel worse. But I think you're completely right, and I think it's great that we have fictions such as this, actually kind of putting it into context of real life. And speaking of context, I have this really weird thing when I read your books, and I read it in Case of Emergency, and I read it in This Is Fine as well. When I read the book from, I guess, the perspective of the protagonist, I think it's you. Have you had that from other readers?
I had that with the first one, with In Case of Emergency. I think it's because my writing style is also a little bit how I talk.
Yeah.
So, but the second one is definitely, I don't think the first one was me. I think she's based on people that I know, and maybe some of that is myself, but the second one is definitely not me.
Because I'm like, I genuinely feel like I'm just in Poorna's brain right now, but she's Padma right now. Because you also have a niece, and I actually want to ask you, like, does your niece have opinions about your writing?
She's 9, so no, she doesn't. But she's I think when it came to writing the niece in this book, it's not based on my niece at all.
I mean, I can imagine it wouldn't be.
And I don't know what it's like to have a 15 or 16-year-old niece, right? But I think my niece is like very proud of what I do. But I don't think she's read my stuff yet. I don't know if she can. I'm not sure what the rules are around this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she hasn't. But I'm trying to involve her in my world in other ways. So she comes to the UK. She's based in Spain with her parents. But I'm making her do a weightlifting class in the summer because she's going to be turning 10. And I was like, like Rumpelstiltskin. I was like, when you're 10, I'm going to take you to lift weights. And she was like, oh, okay.
Yes, because when you're 10, it's a rite of passage to do a powerlifting.
Hell yes. I've seen 8-year-olds do a deadlift. She can do it, okay? She's more than capable. Very strong girl. But yeah, I don't know when she'll be allowed to read my books. Maybe now. I'm not sure.
Ooh,
yeah.
Maybe in a few years' time.
Yeah.
It feels like a very grey area because I think the worlds that you create, like, I know they're not completely based on real people, but like it does feel like they might be inspired by like certain circumstances. And I always wonder, like, is that generally what writers do? Do they draw from their own personal experience? I mean, maybe not like, not like the Harry Potter series or whatever, but like in general, when it's like this close to reality.
There's a notebook that someone gave me as a gift, which says on the front cover, "Careful, or you will end up in my novel." And I don't know a single writer that doesn't. It's not necessarily their own lives, but we pick up stories like magpies, right? Like we kind of like just keep them in our brains. And some people, I mean, God, you've just reminded me of. Do you remember Cat Person when that essay did hugely well? I think the woman, there was this whole article that was written about it by this other woman who said that Cat Person was actually based on her real story, and that the woman who wrote Cat Person kind of like lifted it from her and then just put it in this fictional story. So I think writers do that all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that, I don't know, I just think when you're writing fiction that particularly is based in like reality or hyper reality, you probably do pick up a lot of bits and bobs of your characters from people that you see or stories that you've been told. I for sure definitely have some things in there that are familiar. This novel in particular, This Is Fine, maybe less so, but the places that I have tried to bring to life in there are places that are familiar to me, even if I don't know what that exact reality is like to live in.
Speaking of, how do you hope your readers will feel after they read your books?
I think that I want my readers to feel like they've laughed, but that it's also been cathartic and that it's got them to think about their own lives. And I think that, I mean, my books are for everyone, but the reason why I started writing fiction is because I really wanted to write the South Asian women that I knew in my life and more widely that I didn't feel were being represented in mainstream fiction in a way. So sometimes that's something that people say to me is that some of those characters seem so familiar to them, and they should do, because they're probably based on people that you know, which is not something that's necessarily, I mean, we're lucky that we're in a time now where there are a lot more South Asian women writing in mainstream fiction. There's been this amazing burst, right? But definitely when I wrote In Case of Emergency, I didn't feel that. And so it is also, it's for us to find like commonality and resonance, but it's also for other people to know that like our stories aren't just about oppression and trauma. And so it's a lot of different things. Like I hope people take a lot of different things away from how I write and what I write. But I want you to feel as if you just devoured something great and you want to know, you just want to live in that world a little bit longer. Like that's how I hope people feel anyway. But I have high expectations. What can I say?
No, not at all. You can never have high enough expectations of yourself or your work. But I think what I really like about it is you kind of talk about all of the different, like maybe even like darker sides of someone's brain, because they're so complex and nuanced and like going through their own thing, but still trying to do the right thing. I maybe relate to that to an extent in my own value system, which is why I like reading your books, because I also, apart from the fact that it literally sounds like you, which now I know is not true. What is, I guess, something that you would love to write about in the future?
I think, well, it's probably going to be my third book, which is something that I'm going to have to start writing fairly soon. I really want to write about sex and desire for women in their early 40s and maybe their 40s in general, because it's something that I've seen women feel really disconnected from. I think that it's not roadmapped at all. I think that because of this like thing where women in that demographic and beyond are just, you're invisible in a lot of advertising, or there's a very specific aesthetic that's pushed forward. And some women just don't know that it's a thing that they can have for themselves, and they almost like write themselves out of their own story. And that's something that I think I want to explore and look at, and because I don't think that that's a preserve of youth. I don't think that's just something you get to enjoy in your 20s and your 30s. And it's really important for me to, I think, untangle that. And we have so many amazing like South Asian like sex gurus and sex therapists, and I mean Seema Anand, I adore her. You know, I feel that, you know, Sangeeta Pillai, like all of these women who are just doing this incredible work. And we also, as a society, in our community, we hold so much shame around that. And I think that it's really important to disentangle that and to empower women around that. So that's something I'm quite interested in writing about.
Oh, I would love to read that. Have you read Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows? Read that.
Okay.
That is a starting, maybe something to inspire you. But I actually interestingly interviewed Seema, and when I told my mum I was interviewing her, she was like, "Are you sure? Like, you really want to talk about sex on your podcast?" She was like, "Send it to me before you release it."
Yeah.
And I was like, honestly, I'm like, just about to release her episode, and I'm just like, I don't know how I feel. Like, what's my mum gonna say about it?
I think I'm half want to do it as a test to see whether or not my parents read my books.
Yeah, they might be. Actually, now I'll read this one.
Yes.
Just to see what she's
hopefully
putting.
not.
Oh, Poorna, I feel like we could talk for longer. But I want to leave you with one more question, which is, I ask everybody, what do you have strong game in?
What do I have strong game in terms of
anything?
I think I have strong game in, I want to say wrestling, because I've just started to learn how to wrestle, and I'm really at the beginning of my journey with it, but I think I'm actually good.
I love that we all laugh together.
I think I'm so surprised by it, because I think I actually have picked it up quite quickly, and I'm like, in terms of like being physically strong, it's like charging at people like a rhino, and it's so fun. But if you want something like a bit more sort of a broader takeaway, I think that I have strong game in trying new things, like, and opening myself up to the idea that the older I get, the more important it is to try new things and take things on, even things that terrify you. But wrestling is, it's definitely a good one for me. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, well, I hope lots of people listen to this and get inspired to start, trying to charge at people like rhinos.
Thanks.
or just, I don't know, just pick up lifting. Because I actually started lifting a bit more last year and I really enjoyed it. But I find myself, I can't take my legs to the gym. I really struggle to get to the gym. And once I'm there, I love it.
Yeah.
So maybe that's for another episode.
Yeah.
But I'd love to explore more about that. But yeah, thank you for the work that you do, Poorna. I think you're such a powerhouse. You know this already. I won't gush on for ages. But I really hope people pick up your book because it's a really light read, I find. Like, as you know, or considering how heavy some of the topics are, I feel like actually reading it cover to cover is a very pleasant experience, and you really get to transport yourself. And I'm really looking forward to all the fiction you're going to continue to write, because I feel like you're on a real roll with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that there's many more in my future.
Well, looking forward to it. And good luck for everything that you're going to continue to write. And I guess for people who also don't know who you are, I would definitely encourage them to follow you, because I actually feel like watching some of your stuff just like rewires my brain over time, which is
Matali, that's so kind. Thank you.
It's true. And I think we need more people like stepping into their own in the future and continuing to just be, and I think we are doing it as a community, which is amazing to see, becoming loud and proud and just owning who we are, how we look, and yeah, just bringing new perspectives into the mainstream.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hi, me again. Just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Brown Game Strong. I hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it. If you'd like to stick around, then please hit subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can click follow to get updated on all of the latest episodes. It helps me immensely in continuing to bring you more exciting guests and interesting stories so that we can continue to learn about all the awesome work that's happening in our community. Thank you for your support. It never goes unnoticed, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.